My name's Martin Hatch. I've been in the SharePoint space for quite a number of years now. Recently a proud father of two small terrors that run rings around the house, so if you excuse me if I'm a little bit tired today. I've got my Twitter address up there, email address. If you want to get in touch, got any questions, I'll be posting the code and slide decks and everything from this session at some point over the next day or two. So all the demos and things that you see here pretty much should be downloadable and usable as sample code for you to play around with. So, first thing, list display templates 101. Now I say list display templates, or the client-side rendering model, as it's also known as. There are various incarnations of display templates you'll see throughout SharePoint 2013. Yeah, most of the devs were overjoyed when display templates were first announced because it meant no more fiddling around with XSLT files, no more fiddling around with farm solutions and RESX files and render templates that way or custom fields. So we're going to be looking specifically at lists, so list forms, list views. And at the end of the day, a display template is some JavaScript that runs on a page that returns the HTML that you want to render as a string. Simple as that. Very, very basic, but you can make them as complex as you need them to be. And we're going to have, if we have time, some pretty cool demos at the end with Google Maps and taxonomy fields and cascading drop-downs and all sorts of fun stuff. Now, you can target your list templates at specific list types. So you use the list template type, so you can target document libraries, tasks, contacts. You can also target them with view IDs as well. And I think Paul Hunt, who's got other sessions today, he's got a blog post about specifically trying to catch if you've got multiple list views on the same web page, if you're using list view web parts, making sure that your templates don't override each other, which is a bit of a problem. We're going to be looking at some fairly basic examples, but fairly complex topics, if that makes sense. And the other thing is they execute extremely early in the page lifecycle. By definition, the list template has to spit out the output HTML very, very quick and early to be responsive. It typically means that when your code is first executing, a lot of the standard JS libraries that you're used to using aren't available, things like sp.js, sp.core, and all that kind of stuff. But there are, of course, fairly easy ways to get around those problems. So, JSLink. Now, I hear display templates referred to as JSLink quite a lot. It's not really. JSLink is a way of attaching JavaScript to different SharePoint elements so that when that element appears on the page, the JavaScript is automatically loaded. Now, those elements can be fields. You can either do them in the schema XML if you've got custom list definitions. You can deploy site columns. In your field XML, there's a JSLink property that you can bind to. You can do them for content types. You can also bind them to list views, again, either in the schema XML or in the list view web part. The web part properties has a JSLink property, and obviously your list forms as well. Sorry, someone's just blowing up the power supply down the front there. The list form web parts also have web part properties that allow you to specify JSLink. It's really the most elegant way of getting your JavaScript-based display templates out on the page as and where you need to use them. Now, you can simply drop JavaScript on every page in the site and just execute your code on every page and not only fire and do anything when your field is actually being displayed. Not particularly efficient, not very elegant, but it works. If you want to package up a particular column, say a Google Maps field or a Bing Maps or some kind of funky taxonomy field, you can do it at the site column level, and any content editor that decides to add that site column to their list automatically gets the rendering included, or the JavaScript is automatically loaded. Now, the JSLink references can be contextual. There's a bunch of SharePoint context tokens that you can refer to. So you've got tilde layouts, site collection layouts, site collection, and site. I think there's also site layouts as well, but I think I'm not sure how different it is to tilde layouts. And you can also daisy chain these, so you can pipe in between each one. You can daisy chain multiple files in a row. Now, that's particularly useful if, as a good JavaScript developer, you're building reusable frameworks and reusable modules and libraries that you can use again and again. Therefore, you call your library first. You probably call other reference frameworks, like maybe you're using Knockout, maybe you're using jQuery, and then finally, at the end, you call the custom bit of code that simply binds up all your rendering logic to the field you're particularly trying to target. So, we're going to dive straight in. Display and view overrides. Now, I'm going to do a quick demo code so you actually have a look at how this JavaScript hangs together. But initially, the display and view override is just a method that returns a string. But in terms of knowing what you're supposed to render and how that's supposed to look, you get a bunch of, you get a context object that's passed to your method, and that contains some properties you can use to pull out various bits. A current field value is an obvious one. If you want to display a field value, you need to know what the value is, but you need to be careful of some of the field types like taxonomy fields, like lookups, like people fields, because they're going to have the raw string value. So it's going to be ID, semicolon, hash, text value. The current field schema, that's going to be invaluable for some of the more complex data types. So if it's a lookup, the current field schema tells you the list, the ID of the lookup list that it points at. If it's an integer or a number value, it'll tell you what the maximum and minimum values are as the user defined it when they created the column. You can even access the entire schema XML of the taxonomy fields. You can access the term store ID. You can access the term set ID that it's bound to as well. Finally, there's current item. Now, current item gives you the ability to reference the actual properties of the item itself. This is the item that is being rendered. And this has all the properties available through, typically in a list form, you have the strongly typed values, so current item.title, current item.author. For views, for some reason, it works slightly differently, but you can use the good old classic indexing method of current item, square brackets, name of property, and it'll pull it straight out. It's worth noting that views are a bit funny in that regard. If the list view that your JavaScript template is running on doesn't contain the field that you're trying to reference, it'll come back as undefined. So you need to make sure that you include all the fields in your view that you want to display in your template. You could theoretically go and retrieve them with another REST call to the same item, but you're introducing a performance overhead for each item. It's much easier just to modify the view. So, first demo, nice and quick. So, basic display template. Now, I've got myself a SharePoint team site here that I've modified a little bit with some custom content. Just check it's warmed up. And I've just got an announcements list with a couple of announcements in there with 3 items on a page, nothing particularly fancy. And I've got a custom list over here, a few of my favorite colors. And this is just a list with the standard title field, and I've created a text field called color. So if I want to go in and edit this item, I can type in any value I like, and I can store the color values. Fantastic. Now, of course, the first thing you'd want to do here is, well, it's not particularly obvious looking at hash code, unless you're a front-end dev that just reads code, to know what color that is. So the first thing we're going to do is apply a rendering template to this that overrides the color field in views and displays and actually shows you what the color is. So we'll drop into that. Now, I've got a Visual Studio solution. It's actually a farm solution. It doesn't have to be. This is just JavaScript. It can live wherever it likes. You don't even need to use WSP packages at all. You can literally drop it in. If you can bring yourself to open it up, you can use SharePoint Designer. But literally, you could do this in Notepad and just upload the files. Now, I'm using CKS Dev with a farm solution, which also quite nicely means I can open the files, hit save, and it just copies it to the SharePoint root. So the first thing we're looking at is this file, which, yes, is a blank file. So let's copy in the display code, and we'll talk you through this. That's probably too big, isn't it? So I forgot that the screen automatically resizes itself. How's that? That's not too bad. I've got zoom it, so we can zoom in if you can't see it too big. So the first thing we do, again, as a good JavaScript developer, we create ourselves a unique namespace. We don't want to clash with the global namespace. These method calls all need to be available to SharePoint. So you can't create your own privately scoped methods and functions unless you then create a publicly exposed endpoint. Now, all I've got here is a custom auto-executing function. I've got a JavaScript object that has a templates property, that has a fields property, and that consists of an object, which a property of color, which is the field that I'm binding to, and then the 2 override forms that I want to take. So this is display form and view. So in this case, when SharePoint tries to show this field in a display form, it will automatically use this method here to go and retrieve the HTML. Same thing if it wants to appear in a view. Finally, there's this SharePoint client templates, template manager, register template overrides, and I pass it my override object. That's it in a nutshell. Now you can rinse and repeat this so you can have as many fields as you like. So here's another one where I've got 3 different fields with new and edit forms as well as view and display forms. But in this example, we'll keep it relatively simple. So this render color method, all I've got is a string that returns some HTML. Let's just hide that out of the way. So what I'm doing is spinning out a div. I'm using a style tag of background, and I'm using the context.currentItem color to pull out the current value and basically set that as the background of this div. Give it a fixed width, float it left, and then another div below that, which actually shows the text value within that, and I return that as a string. Like I said, it's an HTML method, sorry, it's HTML in a string that's returned by the method. Save that, go back to this list, and I'll run into the good old caching problem. This is typical. Yep, that's all good. You would not believe the number of times I ran this upstairs before bringing it down here. There we go, there we go. So now you've got the color box next to it, very easy to identify which one it is. And you should be able to see the same thing if I go and view the item, because we've got the display template in there as well. There we go. So that's display templates in a nutshell. It is that simple. And obviously you can take that example as far as you want. I'm not going to spend too long on views. Todd Bleeker's actually got a session on Wednesday where he's going to go through some more advanced scenarios with views, looking at conditional formatting, pulling in images and KPIs and all sorts of stuff. But another example is the actual view itself. So this is the overriding of a field for an item in a view. You can also override the entire view. So you can have complete and total control. So this announcements list, for example, it's quite a common requirement on intranets, publishing sites to say, right, we want to have a customized view of announcements or news or something like that. If it's an individual list, like an announcements list, a list view template is very, very easy to override. So I've got here a separate file. This is the announcement view, JavaScript file. And this is slightly different. So instead of overriding the fields, now we've got basically template header, item, and footer. Now the header value and the footer value, I've literally just given it the blank string. It doesn't have to be a method call. Effectively, all the template's asking for is, I've got to render this thing. What HTML should I use? Give me a string. So you can basically give it a function that returns a string type, or you can just type the string in direct. I've also got in the list template type, I've bound it to 104, so it only applies to announcements. And obviously, finally, I initialize that with my register template overrides. Now, for this one, slightly different. Again, a different way of tackling this one. I'm going to prop it into the web part properties. So web part properties, any list form or list view has got, in the miscellaneous section at the bottom, a JSLink property. Now again, if I was doing this in the schema XML and I was rolling out a custom list definition, the schema XML, each view also has a JSLink property, so you can put it in there. There's my reference to my announcements view. Save that, and boom, totally different rendering. So for each item, I'm now completely controlling the rendering of the announcements view. And all that announcements view file is doing is basically creating a formatted date field, and I'm generating some HTML that I need to render out for each of the items. Now, those of you in the room who are looking at me sideways going, table layout, come on. SharePoint itself will inject the outline table and expect it to be a TR and a TD. If you're not overriding the header, and for those of you who might have looked at this and gone, okay, where's the paging gone? And where's my edit, stop, edit, new item, and change view? Those are actually in the header and the footer. So if I strip this footer out and refresh that, you'll notice the paging comes back if I didn't have weird caching issues. Typical. Actually, I know what this might be. Hold on a second. Right. Another thing I think Todd's talking about, minimal download strategy can break display templates in JSLink. Let's see if that's fixed it. There we go. So paging's now back. So I can page my items, but still the item and the headers is still controlled by my display template. If I put the header back in, I get the rest of the header content. Thank you. And I've now got this. And you notice I've got these title, modify body, so you've still got the same headers that the view is expecting to put in. So it's the column headings, because normally it's tabular. And that still works. You can still filter by that. That's no problem. It's all JavaScript based. SharePoint will handle that for you. So that's views, displays, and Forms done. So, new and edit overrides. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. So this is exactly the same as before, but now we need to provide SharePoint with the field value if someone tries to save the list item. And again, this is all handled client-side, it's all handled through JavaScript. Now we do this by using a register callbacks function, which SharePoint provides. We basically use that to give it a function that says, hey, if you want to get the value of this field, go and ask this function over here, and it's going to return the value for you. And that value will be returned as a string. Now again, if you're overriding a lookup field, you need to return the appropriately formatted string for that field type. Now it's basically the same type you're going to get if you get given a field and you need to display it in a display form or for a new or an edit form. Obviously, again, taxonomy fields get a bit more interesting. They get really interesting when you look at multi-lookups, multi-select taxonomies and things like that. So just be a little bit careful with those. How you actually retrieve that, how you go about formatting that is really up to you, but just be aware of that. We can also do validation. So this is not remote event receivers. This is nothing to do with apps. This is nothing to do with event receivers in the traditional sense. There's no C#, there's no server-side code. This is purely client-side JavaScript validation. This does not have any impact on any API calls or any other ways of pushing data in. This is purely in the browser validation. Now, all of the standard validation will be applied automatically. So if it's a required field and you don't provide a value in your callback function, it'll automatically kick off the required field validation. However, if you roll your own rendering of how error messages should show, you need to make sure that you're displaying an error message. Otherwise, if it's a required field, so you'll hit save, and there'll be an async callback in the back that keeps cancelling it and returning false, so nothing happens. It looks like the browser's not doing anything at all. So make sure that you're at least, if nothing else, throw up a noddy alert box to double check that it's actually doing anything. The two things you need for your own validators. You need a validation object. This basically tells SharePoint, what am I validating? And then finally a callback, so that if it doesn't validate, you can control your own logic that does whatever it likes. So you can pop up flashing banners in their face, you can do all sorts of funky stuff, or just display a discrete error message. So, next demo. This is not a very PowerPoint-heavy deck. So now we'll have a look at some editing, and in true Blue Peter style, here's one I made earlier. So here's all the editing code, drop that in. So what I want to do with the editing, the field overrides at the bottom is exactly the same. Now I'm overriding the edit form and the new form with an edit color method. And what I want to do is I want to force them to select colors that I choose. So at the moment they can type in any text they like, it renders, and we're going to say, no, sorry, not on brand. You can only select colors that I want you to select. So the render color is exactly the same. I've now got an edit color method. So the first thing I need to do is this here. This is actually registering my get value callback. So you need to create a form context object. There's a standard line client templates utility get form context for current field. And from that, you can call register get value callback. And you pass in two things. You pass in the field that you want to register and the method that SharePoint is going to call when it wants to know what the value is for that field. Now, one of the slightly more advanced approaches for this, because you'll find that that get color, when it gets called, has no arguments associated with it at all. So to avoid yourself from hard coding everything in so you have a separate method for each individual field, it's a good idea to think about an approach where you actually pass arguments to that method that tells it which field on the form. So if you want to have, say, for example, a custom rendering of a taxonomy field or something, you want to have that taxonomy field 4 times in the same list item, you don't want to have one method that has no idea which of those 4 SharePoint's asking for. We've got that in some of the further samples a little bit later on. Otherwise, I'm returning some HTML, but this time I am defining 3 colors you can pick from, red, green, and blue. It's a slightly boring corporate standard. And I return some select with some options, which is basically a HTML drop-down list. So let's save that. Go over here, and if I go and edit an item, I now have another failed demo. Come on. Favorite colors. Okay, what's going on? Edit form, edit color. That's why I'm using in private browsing, because it should be clearing all the caching every time I load this. Let's try it without. VS deploy, let's try a new item, see if that one kicks it in. Oh, for crying out loud. Wrong one. I'm looking at the wrong file. Genius. You guys are pair programming as well. You could have told me that. Let's save that. Watch my announcements view completely crap out now that I've put the wrong code in. There we go. So now I've got red, bleeding blue. I can pick those. Brilliant. And when I hit save, it's going to go off and call out my callback function and save that value in. Now, obviously, it doesn't affect any of the existing ones. All we're doing is overriding the editing experience, the new experience here. If I go and edit one of these, it's not going to be able to select the one that I want, so it's just going to force me to pick a new one. And off we go. Now, in the callback function, this getColor, all I'm doing is a little bit of jQuery to say, well, I know that I've got a select on the page with an ID of DDL colors, so I'm going to go and grab the value of that. But like I said, you'd probably want to do something a little bit more clever if you're going to create a reusable framework. Now for the validation. It should be this one. So in the validators, I am going to change it up a little bit more. The first thing I've got is in my render method, I have not included. Yes, it is, because it's on the edit one, not render, sorry. On the render method, I've added a span to the end of my HTML before I spit it out. So now I've got a span with an ID of color error. And that uses the standard SharePoint classes for showing error messages and validation messages, but that gives me somewhere I can push an error message as and when it occurs. In addition, in my getValue callback methods, I've also got references to custom validator and validation callbacks. So this time I'm basically saying, right, go and create this validator set object. So this is go and get the collection, the set of validators for the current item. And I want to add to this a custom validator of type color validator that I've defined myself. So I'll show you that in a second. Finally, we then say, right, I want to register a validation callback error callback. I pass in the field name, and I pass it a method that says, if an error occurs, go and call my onError method. And then I actually register the validator itself, where I pass in the validator that I've created up ahead. Validator is being used a lot in these sentences, but hopefully the code is making that clear. Now, the color validator is just this object here. So it's basically a function that returns a prototype of the validate object. That gets passed a value, and it is expected to be returned an object of type validation result, where you pass in a Boolean which says, is this an error? And if it is an error, what is the error message? And that's all standard SharePoint. So all I'm doing is I'm initializing this to say, well, actually, if none of my conditions are met, then no, it's not an error, and I don't have any error messages to show you. And depending on what they could put in, if they select the value blue, then I say, yes, it's an error, and the error message is, sorry, we don't like the color blue. At which point the user goes, well, why did you give me the option to pick a blue color? What kind of rubbish validator is this? So when we fire this off, and I go and edit an item, and I try and make it blue, it saves. Oh, should have sacrificed a goat this morning. Let's try that again, shall we? There we go. So now I'm getting my error message kicking in. And that's being called because my validation method onError is being called, which is this one here. And it says onError, I know that I've got some kind of an element with an ID of color error, and I want to set the internal HTML to a span which has the error message displayed in it. And that's completely generic. So if this was a required field, and I left it blank, it would show you the standard required field message in the same span that I just defined. Now, obviously, you could get a lot more intelligent with these. So in your validator onValidate function, you could do REST calls out to other SharePoint lists. You could start doing various funky JavaScript calls out to custom endpoints, custom web API endpoints to check databases and all sorts of cool stuff. This is a fairly simple example just to get you an idea, but obviously, if you can do this, you can kind of do pretty much anything. So bear in mind the examples are pretty noddy, but it gives you a very good idea of what's possible. So that's the validators, that's editing, that's new forms. You can do an awful lot with just those. Now the next thing I'm going to cover, and this is, now that everything seems to be going much more cloud-driven, this is a bit more of a less useful point because this is farm only. But SharePoint has built-in multi-language support for JavaScript. How many of you knew that? Put your hands up if you knew that already. 2 of you. Gold stars. Well done. So basically, there's a RESX handler that SharePoint automatically includes where you can give it a RESX file, and it will generate a strongly typed JavaScript object, return it so you can load it into the current page, and that gives you string values for all of the properties in your RESX file. Now, there is a couple of problems with this in that if you don't modify your RESX file in a particular way, then they all get loaded as the same object in the same namespace. So if you try and load 2 of them, they overwrite each other. But the trick that I'm using in this is that you can actually specify your own class, your own namespace, so you get your own strongly typed object. All you pass in to actually load this up is you give it the name of your resource file and a culture you want to load. The culture you can dynamically pull off the page. SharePoint exposes a couple of JavaScript properties. SP page context info, for example, if you're on publishing sites, tells you what the current culture of the page is if you're in multi-language. Now, in order to get this working fully, there is a custom attribute that you need to add to your RESX file. And Visual Studio won't let you do this. You've got to kind of crack it open in Notepad. Now, if I hop into my environment here and pull up, let's see, community code, JSLink, resources, let's open this one, and I'll open it in Notepad. And down here somewhere, I have, there we go. So I've got, actually let's highlight that before I kick in. That. So I've added that to my RESX file. So when this loads up, after it's executed, I will have all of the properties in this RESX file available under the mghtemplates.colors namespace. And that can be anything you like as long as it doesn't clash with anything else. So I can now call mghtemplates.colors.propertyValue, and it will return the culture-specific string for that directly from the RESX file. Now, the other thing for this is the resource file has to be in the 15/resources folder, which is where it rules out cloud-based and SharePoint Online. Now, obviously, if you don't have RESX files, and it's not that common for JavaScript, but obviously in the .NET world, RESX files are great for multilingual global solutions. So you might already have a set of strings that you've already predefined, you've already had translated, and you want to reuse them, and it's on-prem. This is a great way of doing it. So, quick demo of this. And I'll drop in my language support here. So, a few things I've had to change for this now. So, first off is I have in my render, I am loading in a color value. So this time I'm actually calling a separate method in my render to actually go and get the color value from somewhere. So I've written my own custom method here that basically goes off and says, right, I want to register using lazy load, script on demand, a reference to this RESX specifying my language strings, which is the name of my RESX file in here, and the culture being SP page, context info, current UI culture name, and that will go off and fire that. I then lazy load that in, and when it's finished loading, I return the colors. I know that that's going to have 3 values in it, so I then refer to my colors.red, colors.green, colors.blue, which are the properties of my RESX file. So this will effectively go and look through the RESX file, construct all the display names for those 3 properties, and then pull them out. I am also doing that in the edit interface. So when I want to, this time I'm basically delay loading. So this is one of the instances where I said this loads very early in the page lifecycle. If you try to drop all of that code in here, the jQuery wait until document ready, the lazy load script on demand function. Basically, SharePoint will wait so long for your JavaScript to actually return the values. And when it realizes that your function's continued and basically hasn't returned anything because it's waiting for some script on demand to continue firing, the ship will sail without waiting for you. So what you'll end up with is a completely blank rendering template. You'll have nothing in there. So the trick around that is I'm basically returning the blank HTML, and then I'm firing this load color dropdown here, which is then basically saying, right, I know that I'm going to have a blank set of, or a templated, scaffolded set of HTML ready to inject values into. Once my other method fires, I know that that's going to be on the page, and I can go and populate that. So if you need to go and retrieve drop-down values from lists for lookups, so you need to initiate taxonomy sessions to go and retrieve managed metadata values or do anything else, this is the way to do it. You spit out the absolute minimum HTML you need, you call another function before you return it, and that other function basically says, well, let's wait until the page is finished rendering, and then I'll go off and do any kind of asynchronous AJAX calls that I need to do, pull the data back, and then populate that through jQuery, or whatever your poison is. So again, in my load color dropdown, I'm simply looping through each of the colors, and I'm injecting these, and finally at the end, I use jQuery to say, right, go and find my dropdown list colors, and I want to change the HTML of that to match. So let's give this a quick whirl. Now, first off, I'll refresh this, in which case you won't see any difference, but that was planned this time. And then I'll go and change the language. I'll change it to French. And I will need to close the browser this time. I should find. Yay, there we go. So obviously I've got the SharePoint language packs installed, which for me personally makes the entire interface completely unusable. But my color dropdown now contains the French values. And obviously if I select one of those, I can't select. There we go. That was funny. What's going on with that? Oh, yeah, good one. Stop doing edit mode. Thank you. So now I've got, what's going on with that? Oh, I'm not doing it in the view, I'm only doing it in the display. So in the view, I should also be doing the same value. So no, I haven't done it for the, sorry, in the display form, I've now got the same value. I haven't overridden the view. So in the view, it's still showing the old value. In the display form, I get the translated one. So that's a very simple and easy way of doing it. And again, if I pop into the debugger, and for those of you who hate IE debug mode and much prefer Chrome, I'm sorry. But we should find in the console, I can access my colors object, and there it is. So that's the object that SharePoint has created for me based on all of the values that I specified in my RESX file on the fly. Okay. So now for some cool stuff. So we've got 20 minutes or so to spend on some slightly more advanced scenarios. So we've so far covered the ability to override the display of an item in both the views and the display forms. We can override the editing of list values. We can validate custom values. We know that we can do multilingual if we need to. Now, obviously, if you're in the cloud, there's various JavaScript approaches to that. You could simply have culture-named JavaScript files with arrays of strings in them that you can reference. There are different ways around it. You don't have to use RESX files. And we know that if we plant some scaffolded HTML and then go off and fire other methods before we finish rendering, we can do pretty much anything else. So what can you do? Hey, that was premature. So let's have a look at managed metadata fields. So this is an example I've knocked up where I kind of figured that managed metadata has been designed by Microsoft really for an almost limitless scale of taxonomical hierarchical data. So they can't make base assumptions around we're only going to have 3 levels or it will work in cascading dropdowns because they don't know what kind of data you're going to put in it, and by definition, it could be huge. In my example, I have got a relatively limited set of, and this isn't the official Microsoft products, by the way, I've keyed this in myself, so something might be wrong, please don't shoot me. I've just got a list of multi-level, some desktop software, some operating systems split by server and OS, server and desktop, and some server software. I've got Forefront, I've got SharePoint. And I kind of thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could do cascading dropdowns for all that stuff? So if I go and change it back into English, is that going to? No, it's not. No. but that one is. There we go. I'm going to edit the item. There we go. I know modifier is pretty close, but you know. So by default, you have this kind of experience, which for some environments isn't awesome. Certain users particularly get a little bit when they look at this kind of interface. So I have a taxonomy field example over here. So all I want to do is comment back in the fact that I'm actually overriding it. Go and fire this off. And we now have cascading drop-downs of exactly the same values. So I can go into operating systems, I can go into server OS, I get a list like that. Pretty neat example. And it's dynamically cascading. So again, it's as complicated as you can do in JavaScript as you as a developer can build. You've got the flexibility to now do this. Now the code behind this is fairly straightforward. I actually have a single method in here, a single object called taxonomy. I'll kind of wrap this up, trying to make this slightly more reusable this time. So I've basically got a generic taxonomy edit mode method that you can point it at, and it will use the schema of the current field to make sure that this can be recursively reused on as many list items as you need or as many fields as you want within the same item. So by default, we kick off edit mode. Now, we register our get value callback, and I'm using here, instead of just saying, here's the name of my function, I've got getValue.bind. Now, bind allows you to say, don't just call this method dumb, but when you call it, I want you to pass some additional values to it as arguments. So I've got the field name is being passed to my getValue callback. So when my getValue is called, it knows which field I'm trying to retrieve the value for, and I can dynamically work out then where is that data going to be in the form. I've then got my load field method. So I'm going to basically wait and then finally load the field when I want to. And again, I'm using current field schema. This gives me the SSP ID. What did I just press? I don't know what that did. I hate when that happens. I'm sure it wasn't important. Let's see. So I want to load in a bunch of values here. So I've got the SSP ID, that's the term store ID that you're going to need to go and work out which term store it is. Typically you only have one term store, so it'll just be the managed metadata service, but you don't know that. Your farm might have multiple term stores, particularly in Office 365, which all of this works in, by the way. You need to get the tenant-specific term store for your tenancy. You also have the term set ID that it's bound to, and obviously I want to pass in the current field value. So if it's an existing value, I want to make sure it's automatically selected. And then finally, I spit out a drop-down list, and I give it an ID using the field name as part of my prefix. Because this is the internal field name, there's no spaces, and it's a nice friendly-ish text value that I can use. I've also got an input where I actually store the value that I want to retrieve when someone hits save. Now in my load field, and I know that I've got this basic scaffolding in there, I know that if I construct using the field name, hash tax underscore field name, that's going to be the element for the current field, regardless of what field name it has, regardless of how many fields there are on the list. And I basically use a standard wait until the page is finished loading, and then we're back in the standard JavaScript object model to go and retrieve taxonomy sessions and fire this off. Now, this isn't a taxonomy session JSON brief, but effectively you create a taxonomy session from the current client context. You then can use get term stores by ID, get term set, pass in the ID, and then you can use term set.get terms, and that gives you all of the terms for the current term set, if that makes sense. I then load them in, and after that's finished firing, I basically loop through and drop those in option values. I'm also using an on-click event, so if someone clicks on one of those options, I can fire off a jQuery event. This is all standard JavaScript. None of this is particularly magic plumbing. If you know JavaScript, this should be pretty straightforward. And I'm obviously injecting the term ID as the value and the term name or label as the text to display within the option. Now, obviously, if I then want to add child dropdowns, the click event that I've got for the jQuery element is a method called selectTerm. So in this case, I know that if I have selected an option, it will reference the ID of a term in that term set. So I can use that just saying, right, go and get the value in the text of the option that I've just fired that from. That'll give me the term ID and the text of the label. I can then again fire off, update the input field so that I know which one I've just clicked on in case I need to save the value. They might not select the third option. They might want to only go 2 levels down. And then down here again, I create my taxonomy session, and this time I use taxonomy session.getTerm, pass in the term ID. So now I know exactly which term they clicked on, and I can use that to say, go and get the child terms of that term. Off you go. Same thing again, recursively loaded in. And that's all this is doing. So relatively straightforward, but quite powerful. Now, another example, let's move away from taxonomy fields. Let's go and have a look at lookup fields. Now, lookup fields have, for quite a long time in SharePoint, been used as a kind of slightly more configurable version of choice fields. You can independently scope the security permissions. You can have a single lookup list with additional information that you can pull down. There's a couple of quirks with them that I don't particularly like, and it's certainly ones that when users have looked at them, depending on how you're using the lookup, if it's not actually a tangible item in its own right, it might be, say, literally a lookup list of officers, but it doesn't actually contain any information about the office. It's not a page about the office. It doesn't send you to lots of information about that office. It's just effectively a drop-down choice. But you get these lovely clickable links. So one of the first things that I did is I went in and overridden all of those, and if I turn this one on, that's the wrong one. Oh, where's it gone? Yeah, there it is. Thank God for that. Hey, it worked. How about that? So now I've removed the links. I'm basically displaying them as plain text. I've neatened up this associated one. So instead of it being a semicolon delimited list, it's now a nice ordered list of items. I can sort them alphabetically. You could group them. You can do all sorts of fun stuff. If I go to the edit form, instead of the old interface that you used to get, I've now got cascading drop-downs. So if I select region and I go to Europe, it automatically changes all of these, and my multi-select lookup is now checkboxes. So I can check all, select all. I can do something like that. Hit save, all of my value callbacks fire off, and now I've got a completely custom interface. That literally took an afternoon to write. It's really very simple, but gives a very different interface to what you're used to. And just to give you an idea of how different that is, if I go back to here, I've got a lookup to region, a lookup to country, and this associated countries one as well. The way that this works is my countries list also contains a lookup to region, and in my display template, I'm going a REST call to the region saying, go and get me all the countries for this region. So it's basically a REST call to the countries list, filtering by region, saying, go and get me the countries for the region that they've just selected, and go and fire them off down here. Now, if I go and turn that off, the interface is pretty nasty. So this is now all of them, but obviously there's no correlation between this and this. This is just a massive list of God knows what. You can make this as complicated or as simple as you need it to be. Certainly this, yeah, technically it works, but certainly for smaller result sets, when you've only got like 6 items, it looks a bit rubbish. Just having 3 or 4 checkboxes makes it a lot easier. Slightly more fancy stuff. Let's go and have a look at locations. So, not project locations, location. Hey. This is Google Maps implementation. So this is where I basically needed to provide geospatial data for projects. So they wanted to have a bunch of locations, cities, defined areas, if I load up the areas one as well. So you can draw on maps and create areas like that. And this has got, this is obviously the view. You've got a larger thumbnail of the item within that, which for some reason has London and Paris. This is me playing around in the speaker room, unfortunately, demoing it to someone else. And in the edit form, I am basically spitting this out as basically flat HTML. But here I'm using the JavaScript SharePoint dialog, so that when I click select, I now go off and load off a custom form somewhere. Now, this could theoretically be a application page if you're doing farm solutions. It could just be an HTML file, sat in the style library or wherever you like. All it needs is HTML, all it needs is JavaScript, and off you go. But in this instance, I'm going to set that back to London. I'm going to save that, and all the values get fired back in. Now, if I turn this off, and you're going to kind of get an idea of what this is actually doing, This is actually a text field. So if I turn that off and refresh that, all I'm storing in there is the coordinates. And I'm using everything else through the display template rendering mechanism to go off and build the Google Maps interface, hook up all the callouts, hook up the dialogues, and do lots of cool stuff. Back in the areas one, this was doing spatial areas. All I'm doing is a concatenated string. That's actually a multi-line text field because I needed to store more data. But that's just a concatenated string of lat-long coordinates that I then use to build a spatial area using the Google Maps API. So again, really, the world is your mollusk. You can do pretty much anything that you need to do. I appear to be way ahead of time. I'm not sure, have I spoken too fast? That's okay. Was that it? There are a few other gotchas. If I go back home and look at some of the views, some things that you need to think about. If I go and put this announcements view back in, which has possibly completely killed off all of the code because I wiped it out by putting the wrong one in there. So let's see, have I got internet access? Sort control, undo, put it back. Yes, thank you. God, I love, who doesn't use Visual Studio Online for personal projects? It's awesome. Unless you use Git, in which case you're weird. So let's go and, actually this was already bound in, wasn't it? So save and refresh. Browse, browse. No. There we go. Now, I've obviously not put the header and the footer back in there. If I put those two back in, which is that line and that line, there's a couple of things that break quite badly. In particular the header, actually. I don't need the footer. So I go to there. There is some elements that live in the header. So if you're going to think about overriding the header, unfortunately it completely breaks quick edit mode. So if I go to the list and go quick edit, boom, error message. So there's an awful lot of things that you kind of need to be aware of, you're not stepping on the toes of, particularly around views. The list forms and the item rendering, you pretty much game on. You can do kind of anything you like, as long as you're returning the correct values, making sure that when someone loads an item, you are storing and rendering the correct value. It's a case of off you go. Now, in terms of some other sessions you might want to catch, client-side rendering is used all over SharePoint. So all of the search results don't use exactly the same methods, but similar. It's all JavaScript, it's HTML, it's CSS. There's no custom XSLT, there's no C# code, there's no farm solutions. It's all cloud supported, it's all cloud-based. Matt McDermott had a session earlier today, for those who caught it. It was pretty good, all about display templates and query rules. Obviously, you can't go back in time and watch that session, but when you get the DVD box set, make sure you catch that one. Todd Bleeker and Wes Preston also have sessions on Wednesday. So Todd Bleeker's doing, again, he's covering custom forms and conditional formatting, a lot of stuff, slightly more advanced stuff around views. And Wes has got some practical examples, tips and tricks and all sorts. Don't forget, it's the exhibitor night tonight. There's the retro party out in the exhibitor hall. So make sure you get yourself some drinks and have some fun. That was my session. Thank you very much.